In conversation with some industry pals lately, I've seen a lot of reminiscing about when studios could potentially survive a flop, where one bad game didn't necessarily end the studio as we know it. Of course, I think there are plenty of examples of that happening, but at least you could largely trace the logic of decisions made even on a purely profit-driven level. Either a game failed and the studio closed, the game failed and the studio moved on to another project, the game failed upon release and time was invested to reverse that down the line, or the game succeeded and the studio carried on. Oh, how times have changed. Nowadays, in this utterly grim hellscape in which we live, forget weathering a flop. Studios can't even seem to survive a bona fide smash hit. Things just do not make any kind of sense right now. And all of this comes with the news that Microsoft, having acquired ZeniMax and Bethesda in 2021, has taken the utterly baffling decision to shutter not only Arkane Austin, makers of Dishonored and Prey, but Tango Gameworks, the same studio that, among other well-liked games, managed to sneak release Hi-Fi Rush to rapturous critical and, by all accounts, commercial acclaim. Now, you might say that the Arkane closure is understandable because their last release Redfall was such a dud. Even beyond the fact, though, that according to reports, Arkane didn't even want to make Redfall, it was a corporate mandate, the very fact that their legacy is now Redfall, and not, some of the most impressive, beloved immersive sim titles in the last decade or so, is testament to how badly this incredible team got thrown under the bus here. And Tango, at least in a modern context, is completely nonsensical. They actually went the opposite direction to Arkane, producing those titles that didn't set the world on fire, only to veer away from their survival horror roots and produce a comparatively small, bright, colourful game that, while it didn't do a lot for me personally, undoubtedly raised the profile of the studio. It's arguably their biggest title, one that succeeded despite a lack of any real push from Xbox, that headed up the platform's crossover to other consoles, and crucially came at a time when Xbox really needed a hit, a unique title, given their ongoing struggle to produce many compelling software reasons to buy into Microsoft's ecosystem. On every level, Tango produced a hit, the kind that Microsoft should be salivating over as a means of providing profit and boosting brand identity with more sustainable releases. And it wasn't enough. And they're not alone either. The vast layoffs we've been seeing the past while are by no means limited to those studios struggling to produce a successful product. Riot Games, makers of League of Legends, Sony's first-party studios, consistently producing some of the biggest, most successful games in the world. Hell, this isn't even the first time Microsoft has done this year. It won't be the last. The party that was endless corporate acquisitions and venture capital influx, as seen earlier this decade, has indeed well and truly ended, and we have found ourselves fully entrenched in an investor economy as cruel and brutal as it is confoundingly myopic. We now have a whole bunch of employees, human beings, some of whom uprooted their lives to work for these companies, and having made games loved by literally millions of players in an industry still worth billions, now being forced back into a job market saturated with thousands of people from other companies in similar situations. But much like surviving a nuclear blast, it's not as if it's much better for the people remaining. Their morale is already through the floor, losing not only resources, but long-time team members, friends. And worse, they now know that no matter how well a game sells, there is nothing they can do. They could very well be next. I mean, you have to wonder how Ninja Theory is feeling with the imminent release of Hellblade 2 and almost zero marketing to show for it. The thing is though, arguably, it wouldn't matter if it had marketing or not. Even viewed from an entirely artless, profit-driven perspective, it somehow isn't about producing a product that sells or doesn't sell, that profits or doesn't. It's about whether a completely arbitrary line, seemingly totally separate from an individual product's performance, can keep going up. Itself a wholly unrealistic expectation, and the second it dips, the investors that are at the head of the table go into panic mode, making rash, nonsensical decisions like the ones outlined for the sake of the shortest term gains without an ounce of thought given to the long-term costs. The industry of games as we know it is broken beyond belief, and some might say beyond even repair. But maybe we should have seen this coming, because I think there are parallels to be drawn with other industries that might give us an idea of where things could feasibly be headed. I, for one, have spent a lot of time in the world of music, where it has long been understood that major labels are culturally bankrupt vultures who will promise people the world, fame and fortune, and then proceed to make their lives a misery, even if they produce a hit, simply because the label could stand to make just a bit more money or claim a tax write-off. I personally know quite a few people who were understandably lured in by said promise, who almost made it, and who subsequently cannot even perform using their own given name because it's owned by another company in perpetuity throughout the universe. That's legitimately the language that gets used in contracts. And because of said contractual nonsense, these artists that were set to be huge have their best music, all recorded and paid for, simply left to fester, locked away forever. It will never be heard. And I have heard enough horror stories in this regard that I simply cannot fathom wanting to sign my own art, my life, away like that. Maintaining artistic control, being able to maneuver freely and make what you want how you want, to be able to withstand a few business failings here or there, is to me not even a choice. It is well worth the lack of money up front. It's worth sacrificing the chance to be shoved in front of a potentially slightly bigger audience. It's worth the extra work required in terms of putting together a DIY release. Ultimately, it's a liberating feeling to realize that you don't need to be the biggest or most popular thing in the world. If you really think about it, you do not want that. If you can keep trucking along while doing what you love, that is the only goal worth pursuing in my book. And I say all of this because it is a well-recognised truth in other media production circles that corporate ownership might as well be a death sentence. If not now, then eventually. The relationship with art in that environment is inherently hostile, and you can't help but look at the world of games in that light and think, maybe there's something to be learned here. You know, there's that meme going around that people want smaller games with worse graphics made by people who are treated fairly, and others saying that graphics peaked with the PS2 and we don't need any more graphics. Now, obviously memes and online posts like this might not capture all the complex realities of media production, but the underlying sentiment that, hey, games as an industry is bloated to the point of critical unsustainability, and maybe for the sake of everyone involved we need to seek fundamental change in the way we think about it, is, to me, pretty self-evidently correct, and something that people clearly resonate with. I've been working on another video about how I cannot keep up with the sheer volume of incredible indie releases right now. That stuff is out there, not only more adventurous than the unsustainable AAA mush, but arguably more mechanically, technically sound these days. Far less expensive to boot, and your support actually has a measurable impact there. And none of this means that games suddenly have to make no money whatsoever. You know, I don't claim to know about the ins and outs of a company I'm not a part of, but man, look at Supergiant, a company that just released Hades 2 into early access, one of the most hotly anticipated titles, coming off the heels of what many, myself included, would consider a classic. Itself following up a series of titles that are instantly recognisable as Supergiant games. Those titles they retained full control over, and they self-published. Outside of a basic need to keep a roof over people's heads, they have proven themselves and their model successful, and can now focus on making art of ludicrously high quality at their own pace. Or take Larian, a studio who released the biggest game in God knows how long last year, and who presumably became a ridiculously hot commodity, with businessmen seeing dollar signs, all while the studio heads have kept things admirably in perspective and turned it all away. While it does feel a bit weird to use this term in this context, they are technically an indie studio. They will not be involved with Baldur's Gate going forward, and they have been sensible enough in their hiring strategies to make sure they can retain as many people as possible. Again, they are established enough that their next release will undoubtedly be massively anticipated, but now it doesn't matter if it ends up being not quite as big as Baldur's Gate 3. They get to focus on what they're passionate about, with the benefit of all the institutional knowledge the developers have gained over the years, with employees that presumably feel at least somewhat more valued than they would do at a larger corporation owned by an even larger corporation. Larian presumably turned down a lot of money in the short term in not pursuing the franchise further, and as such, it might seem like there are sustainability risks in going their own way. But as we can plainly see, it's not like the other route offers anything in the way of security, even in the short term. I mean, surely at this stage, corporate acquisition has to be viewed as a dagger held over the heads of every single employee a studio has, and that if a game idea cannot be realised without heaps upon heaps of venture capital funding from those who have proven they will pull the trigger without a moment's hesitation should that graph dip even slightly, while calling it troubling economic headwinds, then maybe a different, more sustainable game idea should be considered and pursued instead. Because as much as people like Phil Spencer like to say every time about how devastated they are and how unavoidable all this stuff was, don't believe them. They do not see you as artists. They barely even see you as people. The prior markers of success are no longer applicable. Those at the top are looking at a completely different graph to you. This Microsoft nonsense is a keen example of the fact that nowadays it's not about making a hit. It's not even about producing a flop, but being given enough grace to right the ship for next time. If you aren't controlling things yourselves, you are not safe. Within that thoroughly broken corporate framework, even making the most successful games of all time will almost never be enough. Apologies for the rather depressing episode, but thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, all that daft YouTube stuff. It really helps the channel and it means the world. A massive thanks as well to my patrons, who you can see on screen and are all getting access to exclusive, fully produced videos that aren't available here. Your continued support is what allows me to keep going with the work I do on this channel, and I seriously cannot express how grateful I am for that. You are all the best. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsyuk, Michael Tritt, Alex O'Sullivan, Rickety Cricket, Cameron Siniseros, Don McLean, Urban Cheese, Charles J. Liu, Alistair Dunn, Vitautis Catharsis, Dolly Bowman, Young Condor, David Karstens, Tom Webster, Danis Sikauskis, Jordan Midler, Christopher Faherty, Nicholas Villeneuve, Yogesh Deshpande, Joe Lanzone, Leah Chinello, Captain Knussbrich, Dylan Robinson, Bryce Snyder, CPJ MLT Limited, David Björk, Nellen Palacios, Timothy Jones, Carl Christensen, Matthew Grover, Shardfire, Lynn Browning, Dallas Keane, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.